Polio. Polio epidemics swept across Western Europe and North America from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. The disease killed thousands, primarily children, and left thousands more severely disabled or paralyzed. Doctors of the 19th and 20th centuries could not explain why the disease had suddenly struck in such magnified proportions. Until researchers in the late 20th century discovered the cause of polio and developed a cure, no one could stop the debilitating and deadly disease. We now know polio is caused by a virus. A virus is a submicroscopic parasite that reproduces inside human cells. The polio virus enters the body orally, through the mouth, and leaves the body excrementally, through fecal matter. It first attacks cells in the throat and intestines. Early symptoms are similar to those caused by a common cold or stomach virus. Paralysis occurs if the virus moves into the central nervous system and destroys motor neurons. Neurons receive and transmit messages from the brain to the body's muscles, telling them when and how to move. In rare cases, victims paralyzed by polio also suffer paralysis of the muscles that control breathing. Without the aid of a machine to induce breathing artificially, these victims die. People usually contract polio by drinking water contaminated with the virus. When the Industrial Revolution of the early 1800s encouraged mass migration into cities offering work in factories, diseases such as tuberculosis, typhoid, smallpox, and cholera raged throughout filthy, overcrowded slums. Ironically, however, polio became a major threat to public health only after sewer systems were updated, water supplies were cleaned, and general sanitation was improved. Before public sanitization efforts, when exposure to polluted water was unavoidable, most people caught polio as infants. Polio contracted at a very young age causes only mild symptoms and produces a lifelong immunity to the disease. With clean water supplies, however, fewer people were exposed to polio as infants. Most were eventually exposed through contact with an infected person. In these cases, symptoms were catastrophic. For several decades, polio epidemics struck cities across the industrialized world. While a handful of researchers searched for causes and cures for the disease, most doctors simply treated the effects of polio and found ways to help patients cope with an incurable illness. Early treatments consisted of splinting and casting paralyzed or disabled limbs to offer support and protection against further injury. This treatment, however, immobilized and weakened healthy muscles bound alongside those disabled from polio. Sister Elizabeth Kenny, a retired nurse for the Australian Army, recognized the debilitating nature of these treatments. She developed alternative treatments that included exercising, stretching, and massaging the affected muscles. Although her practices were scoffed at and condemned by early 20th century doctors, they nonetheless helped countless polio victims regain full range of motion in their arms and legs. By the late 1940s, doctors had determined the cause of polio and learned the best methods of rehabilitating patients. Infection, however, remained unstoppable. Beginning in the 1930s, physicians developed and tested numerous vaccines that would immunize children. Early results were disastrous. Children administered with the first experimental vaccines fell ill, and many died. These vaccines failed for two reasons. Researchers were unaware that there were 3 types of polio. In order to be effective, a vaccine had to include all 3 types. In addition, procedures used to kill or weaken the polio virus used in these vaccines were inexact. Consequently, the vaccines may have been too strong for the human body to combat or too weak to have any effect. Finally, in 1952, Dr. Jonas Salk tested an injected vaccine he had created using deactivated polio viruses on human subjects. His vaccine was a success, even though production of the vaccine was not entirely foolproof. Since it was difficult to determine whether all the viruses in a batch of Salk vaccine had been killed, rare but devastating incidences occurred in which accidental live viruses in the vaccine caused mass breakouts of polio. The search for a more reliable vaccine continued until Dr. Albert Sabin created an oral vaccine which used live, weakened polio viruses. Both the Salk and Sabin vaccines contributed to the dramatic decrease of polio infections worldwide. They helped eradicate the disease in the United States and most of Western Europe.